So let's look at how you fill in the risk register. So we've already looked at how you are doing your hazard assessment. We've looked at how you are doing your process mapping. So now let's look at how you now handle these identified risk in the risk register. So this is your risk register. So it's the biggest sheet of all the sheets that are in this workbook. So it has a lot of columns as compared to the other parts as well. So like I mentioned, so everything that you indicate in the process map will automatically come to the risk register. So whatever you enter under the process map, the template will transfer all your risks to your risk register. It will also transfer the what happens part of the risk or the process map to the risk register. So the process activity is the what happens part of the process map. So we're going to look at one or two of the identified risks, so the scenarios that we created in the process map. So these scenarios, like we said, the points at which maybe you can get exposed to whatever biological agent you are analyzing at that particular point. So we're going to look at this particular scenario or possible risk that we identified in the process map. So blood spills while the lab staff is transferring the blood from the syringe to the collection bottle. So we are transferring the blood to the collection bottle. Then blood spills. So what will this tell us, or what will happen if this particular scenario happens? So under column E, this is where you're putting the potential effect of failure. So the potential effect of failure is what will happen if this scenario happens. So what is the potential effect if this happens? So we are talking about the risk of exposure, or the risk of exposure to biological agents. In this case, it may be hepatitis B that we're talking about. So if that particular blood or that blood spills, while you're transferring it from the syringe to the collection bottle, it means that at that particular point, the likelihood of you getting exposed to the blood increases. And if the likelihood increases, it means that when you get exposed, it means that now you face the consequences of actually being exposed to this biological agent that may be in the blood or in the sample. So the potential effect here is that exposure to the biological agent in the sample, that's a potential effect. You get exposed to the biological agent that is in the sample, and the sample in this case being blood. So in the next column, you are going to now indicate the current control measures. So what have you put up as a laboratory? What have you put up as a laboratory to either reduce or make sure that this particular scenario doesn't happen? In this case, what have you done as a laboratory to make sure that the chances of someone spilling the blood while it's being this blood is being transferred from the syringe to the collection bottle reduce? Or what have you done to make sure that you eliminate this scenario where someone does not need to transfer blood from a syringe to the collection bottle? So what have you done as a laboratory? So maybe at that particular point, what you've done is you've distributed the laboratory handbook. So the laboratory handbook will give information on how to collect the sample, and then it will also give information on how to transport the sample, how to request tests, which bottles are supposed to use. So it's a document under the quality management system that guides either the clinicians or the end users on how they are supposed to collect the samples, how they are supposed to carry out all the activities that will lead to a sample reaching in the lab that will achieve quality results. So if you've distributed the laboratory handbook, it means that you have that laboratory handbook in your system. So we're going to say, let's do this. So if you've distributed, it means you have created. So we're going to say you've also created or developed laboratory handbook. Created a laboratory handbook. Then not only have you created this laboratory handbook, you've also distributed the laboratory handbook. And then maybe after you distribute this laboratory handbook, you've trained everyone that is responsible for either collecting the sample, requesting samples, or transporting samples on how to use the laboratory handbook, or you've trained people on the laboratory handbook. So you've created, distributed, and trained people. So if you've created the laboratory handbook, you've distributed the laboratory handbook, and you've trained people, it means that at least you know that people will know how to properly collect the sample in a manner which will also reduce the risk of them getting exposed to whatever may be in the sample whilst they are collecting the sample. So at this point, at least you would have said the chances of this scenario happening would not be high as when you didn't have these particular control measures in place. So maybe that's what you've done as a laboratory. So now let's look at what are the chances now of this scenario happening. So before you calculate the likelihood, you need to consider the current control measures that you've put in place. So a handbook is prepared, distributed the handbook, trained people in the handbook. Then also you need to look at the history now. Have people as this particular scenario, let me say it in this way, has this particular scenario ever happened before? And then if it has happened before, how many times has it happened? So that will now tell you the chances or the likelihood of this scenario happening in future. Remember, what we are doing is a risk assessment where we are thinking ahead of the problem. So we're being proactive and trying to see if maybe we are trying to see the chances of this scenario happening in future. And then also we're trying to see if this scenario happens, what is the consequence? So in this case, you need to look at the past history. Then you need to look at what is currently happening for you now to determine what will happen in the future. So you're looking at, has this scenario ever happened? If so, how many times and how often has it happened? Is it every month? Is it every year? And then is it every 2 years? So the only way you're going to know if it has happened before is if you are monitoring your incidents. So if you're doing proper incident management, you'll be able to know to say this particular scenario or this particular incident has happened before. So if you're not, in this case, you assume that maybe it has never happened before, but then you'll be lying to yourself that it will never happen since it has never happened before. So it's always important to also monitor your incidences and check whether or not these incidences are happening. So most of these scenarios where maybe blood is being collected may not happen in the laboratory area. Sometimes maybe the samples may be collected outside of the laboratory. So maybe the samples are being collected in the outpatient, or they are being collected in the wards. So in this particular case, you need to interview some people either in the OPD or in the wards and ask them, have you ever been exposed to samples or to the blood while it's transferring this particular blood from the syringe to the collection bottle? So in that particular case, you then get, at least you get an accurate idea of where now the chances of this scenario happening again will fall, like where will the probability or the likelihood fall. So let's assume that In this case, maybe this scenario has never happened before. No one has ever transferred, or no one has ever spilled blood. And then also you've put up these current control measures that you have. So there are these current control measures. So in this case, if you need to determine your likelihood, let me just zoom in a bit. So now in this case, if you need to create, or you need to determine the likelihood, we are going to say, let's pick from what we have. So those are the possible likelihood ratings. So there's unlikely, remote, occasional, moderate, and frequent. So interpretations of these ratings was done under the biosafety risk assessment session. So you can rewatch that session and then you'll be able to get the definitions of these particular ratings. So if it has never happened before, and then you at least have some current control measures that you've put in place, then maybe you're going to say this will be remote, because there are certain measures that you may be missing. For example, for you to eliminate this particular scenario, you may need to change the way you're collecting the blood, or how you are doing your sample collection. Because if you are still using syringes, it means that this particular scenario may occur. But then if you change from using the syringes and then you start using maybe the vacuum tenors, it means that you've eliminated this scenario from happening. So at this particular point, we can't indicate to say this is unlikely, because there's that chance, because people are still using this particular type of procedure when collecting the samples. Therefore, there will always be a chance that this will happen. But then maybe if you change the way people are doing the activity, then you would have eliminated this scenario completely, and therefore this becomes unlikely or to happen. But then at this particular point, it's remote, because people are still doing that particular activity while it's collecting the samples. All right, so now let's look at the severity rating, or the consequence. So for the severity rating, the severity rating will be constant. So whatever you determined under the hazard assessment as your severity will be your severity even under this part. Because if you get exposed to what is in the sample, it means that you get infected maybe to that particular sample. And therefore you cannot put severity ratings that are different on the different scenarios. So you need to go back and check, what did you determine maybe under hepatitis? So under hepatitis, which is there, so under hepatitis, under the severity, we said the severity or the impact of exposure is very serious. So in this case, even our rating here would be very serious. So the only way that this particular severity will reduce is if that particular biological agent has a vaccination, or you can get immunized. And if you get vaccinated, it means that you can now reduce the severity. But then the only way again you can reduce the severity is if everyone in the laboratory, or everyone who's doing that particular procedure, is vaccinated. So in as much as this particular agent may have a vaccine available, the rating will not reduce until people are actually vaccinated. So vaccination does not automatically, the availability of vaccination does not automatically reduce the consequence. It is now after you conduct the vaccination that this severity rating will reduce. So if you get people vaccinated, it means that maybe this will reduce maybe to a serious and not very serious. But if you go to the hazard assessment, this particular severity will remain the same, because this is your inherent risk. or your initial severity. So at this point, you are looking at the risk, the way it exists, even though there's like availability of treatment, but then you are still looking at the severity even before people get vaccinated. But at this point, if people get vaccinated, then you can reduce the severity, not on the hazard assessment, but on the register. But if people are not vaccinated, then this becomes constant. If there's no vaccination for that particular agent, it means that this particular severity can never change. It will still remain the same, because there's whenever people get exposed, they'll have almost the same type of severity, because there's no sensitization to the immune system, therefore to still remain the same severity. The only way that the severity will reduce is if you consider now the host status, so how healthy is a host at that particular point. But then mostly our health is never constant sometimes. So sometimes you may be sick, sometimes you may be not. So it's never really constant. So the only way you can reduce at that particular point is after you now determine the host status, and then now that becomes a bit complicated. So at that particular point, the severity will constantly remain the same as the hazard assessment. All right, so after you determine the likelihood and then you determine the severity, the template will automatically calculate your risk, or your risk priority number. So how do you calculate? So you just get the 2, then you multiply by 4, then you're going to have 8. Then if you go to the risk matrix, you look at where these two will be meeting. That is the likelihood rating of 2 and 4. And this is translating to a moderate risk. So at this point, what we can say is that this risk is not high, and then it's not very high, but it's not also low. So mostly what we want is for our risk to be in the low, or be falling in the low. At least that way we would say this risk is acceptable. But then the acceptability of the risk will highly depend, or will be guided by what you defined as a facility. But at this particular point, we may say this risk is unacceptable, because there is a chance that you can still get exposed to this biological agent by this risk, or by this scenario. So if this particular scenario or risk is now unacceptable, it means that we need to put up extra mitigation measures, because we already have some measures that we've put in place, but then we need extra mitigation measures. So now what you need to put under the potential causes of failure is the root cause. So what do you think can cause you to get exposed in relation to this scenario? So what do you think can actually lead to you getting exposed? So if we look at the scenario, and if we look at what is there, the laboratory handbook is available and staff are trained, so we can say the cause is that samples are being collected using a needle and syringe. So if you are collecting samples using a needle and syringe, it means that this scenario will always be there, and therefore the risk will always be there. So samples are being collected using a needle and syringe. That's one of the major potential causes of this particular scenario. So let's just have one potential cause. So under the action number, so the action number mostly will come from your the action number will come from your preventive action log. So we'll not cover that under this part of the mentorship. So we're going to leave this blank. But then if you've done your preventive action and you've proposed preventive actions, you're supposed to now put these preventive actions on your preventive action log. So the log will have like sequential preventive actions. So maybe at this particular point, this the potential action will be so this potential action or action will come from your root cause analysis. So maybe this potential cause will be 009, which is number 9 on your action log. So now let's look at the recommended preventive or mitigation actions. So when you're doing your preventive or mitigation actions, the best way to come up with preventive action is to make sure that you have preventive action that is targeting all your causes. That way, you're going to put up something that will eliminate the cause. If the cause is eliminated, it means that there won't be any chances of that particular scenario happening. So in this case, what we're saying is that we have one potential cause, which is samples are being collected using a needle and syringe. Therefore, our mostly preventive action is that we need to stop using the needles. So we need to, how can I put it, start collecting samples using the vacuum turners in this case. So if you use the vacuum turners, it means that you would have eliminated this particular scenario in that particular point. But then collecting, okay, start collecting vacuum turners. Hope I've spelled vacuum turners correctly. So also you need to train staff on how to use the vacuum turners. That is the vacuum turner needles. So you need to train staff on how to use the vacuum turner. But then vacuum turners. Okay, vacuum turners. That way, you've started collecting blood using vacuum turners, and people are now trained, and therefore you eliminate the scenario all at once, and then also you've created awareness, and people now know how to use the vacuum turners, therefore reducing the risk of this scenario happening. So responsible person, so who's the person that will be responsible to make sure that these mitigations are put up or they are implemented. So in this case, maybe your safety officer will be in charge. Time frame, maybe you say maybe after 1 month, that's when you complete the implementation of these preventive or mitigation actions. So the duration or the time frame will highly depend on the risk itself. So if you have high or very high risk, you may need to set a shorter time frame as compared to maybe moderate or low risks that you have. So in this case, maybe a month may be enough to actually implement these particular mitigations. Then also the complexity of the preventive action. So if it's something where you're just creating a document and maybe you're supposed to do training, that will need a shorter time frame. But then if it's something where you need to buy or procure something which is very expensive, it means that at that particular point you may need to put up a longer time frame, because you may need to look for that particular money to get that particular item. And then if you do not have the money, it takes even longer now, because you need to lobby for some funds. So therefore, lobbying and now procurement and now implementing and training people on that item will take longer, therefore your time frame may span from maybe 1 month to a year, or 1 month to 6 months or 3 months, depending on how complex or how expensive that particular item is. So risk assessment team. So under risk assessment team, you're just indicating the people that were part of the risk assessment itself. So who were the people that were part of conducting the risk assessment? So maybe you had 6 people, and those are their names. So you indicate their names under the risk assessment team. Okay, so now action taken, that is the status now of the action. So here you're indicating if you've implemented or if you've not yet implemented the proposed or the recommended preventive or mitigation actions. So if you do the risk assessment today, it means that all your actions will be pending until you implement. So even 2 is pending since we have 2 action items. So number 1, which is you start collecting samples. Sorry, I think I didn't finish this part. So start collecting samples using vacuum. Maybe you haven't yet implemented. It's been a day, so you are still maybe strategizing on how you're going to start and everything, because there may be a challenge of maybe these are not available, so you may need to procure these as well. So if you need to procure them, it means that procurement of the vacuum becomes a preventive action as well, because for you to start collecting, you need to procure. So procurement also becomes a preventive mitigation action. And after you procure, you then train the staff on how to use the vacuum turners. Then after you train the staff on how to use the vacuum turners, you then start collecting samples using the vacuum turners. So these are like mostly, maybe at this point it's maybe just a day or 2 days, and you don't have these vacuum turners in place, therefore these will be pending. And then maybe after a month, so you've given yourself a month to implement this. After a month, you need to come back and check, have you implemented these 2? So if you've implemented both, this status changes to either implemented, or you can say done, which means you've implemented both of these measures. At this point, you've done your implementation. You've also checked the implementation. Now let's look at review. So under these columns, starting from where it's written residual risk, this is where now you are doing your review for each of the scenarios. So depending on how long you've defined to say you'll be revising your risk assessment, or you'll be looking at the risk assessment mitigations, you need to come back now to the register and check whether or not this risk has reduced. So maybe after the same 1 month, you can still check, or maybe after 3 months or 6 months, you need to come back and check and see, is this scenario or is this risk now completely eliminated, or has it just reduced the risk? So if you're using the vacuum turners and everyone is trained, it means that at this point this scenario no longer exists. So if it no longer exists, then maybe the chances of even getting exposed by this particular scenario becomes very, very unlikely. But then there's always that 0.00001 chance. So now what will happen in that, let's say in that 0.0001 chance someone gets exposed, it means that the severity will still be there, to be very serious. But then at this particular point, your risk has reduced to a low risk. And that is what we want. We want the risks to be low and not moderate or high or very high. So we need to always have at least the lower risks. So at this point, your risk is acceptable. Okay. Yeah. So, but then if you did not implement the mitigation measures, and then you are now reviewing this particular risk, it means that maybe this will still be remote and the risk will still be high, or it will still be moderate. Apologies, I've forgotten the color. So it will still be moderate risk. So at this point, if the risk is still moderate, it means that you need to put up, or you need to implement the mitigations that you had proposed to put up. So okay, so you need to put up the risks, or you need to put up or implement the mitigations that you proposed. Only when you implement will this particular risk reduce. But then there are certain instances where you haven't implemented, but then during the period from the time you did your initial risk assessment and to the time now where you are reviewing, you discover that after reviewing your incident management, this particular scenario maybe has happened twice or 3 times for this particular risk. It means that at this point, this risk has now increased, or the chances has now increased, and the risk has increased because at that particular point, the chances or the likelihood of this particular risk happening has increased because this risk has happened before. So the incident management will tell you to say, this has happened, and therefore your likelihood will jump from remote maybe to moderate. So you have not implemented, and since you've not implemented, something has happened, and then it has happened on a couple of occasions. And therefore, at this point, the risk has increased because of lack of implementation. If that risk has, or the chances has increased, so if the chances increase, it means that even the risk increases. At this point, now the risk is very high. So now at this point, you need to pull up your socks with your implementation. It means you need to implement your proposed preventive or mitigation. Only when you implement, that's when maybe the chances will reduce. So if the chances reduce, even the risk reduces. So how do you know that the risk has reduced? So this is where you do maybe your next review. Let's say it's been 3 months after you did your initial review. So maybe this is your second review, and in your initial review, you found that there were incidences of that particular scenario. So your risk was, in the initial assessment, your risk was moderate. But then in your initial review, you find that the risk has increased because there has been incidences of that particular scenario. So now your risk increased. But then let's say at this point you've implemented your mitigations. So now after you implement your mitigations, you find that the incidences have reduced. We're not saying the incidences have you've completely eliminated the incidences. Like the incidences are still happening, but then at this particular point of the review, the incidences maybe have reduced from 5. Maybe you're having like 1 incident, maybe one incident has just happened from the time of your initial review to this second review. Now, this means that your likelihood will at least reduce from moderate to occasional. So if your likelihood reduces from moderate to occasional, so this was very serious, it means that your risk is still very high, But then the difference between these two risks is that this is very high, this is high. So they are both high, but one is very high. Then also the risk priority number here will tell you something about the reduction. So you had a risk priority number of 16 in your initial review, but then now your risk priority number is reduced to 12. At least you've reduced the risk rating at that particular point. So you come back again and you're doing now your third review of this particular risk. But then at this time, no incident has happened. So you've done the same, or you've allowed maybe for 3 months as well to just monitor the mitigations. So, but then at this point, no incidences have occurred. Okay, and then at that point, maybe now your risk will reduce to a remote there, and then this will still remain the same, which is very serious. So you've gone back to your initial risk. Then now in your fourth review, you come back again. At this time, it's been like 3 months after your second and third. It was like 3 months, and then now you've added on another 3 months, and therefore for now 6 months we haven't had any incidences of this particular kind. At this point, that's when we can now say this is unlikely, and the risk will now reduce to a low risk. So there are certain times when your risk will increase, and therefore you need to take it back to its initial phases. And after you take it back to the initial phase, that's when it can now reduce further now to acceptable levels. So you need to constantly monitor your risk assessments. So it's always advised at least every 3 months or 6 months you come back and check whether or not your mitigations or your proposed mitigations are working or not. Because if they're not working, you need to put up extra mitigations. And what we mostly want to achieve in risk assessment is all our risk being either reduced or eliminated. So maybe after another 3 months, you will need to come back and check. So you need to either open another register or you add on more columns to this particular risk register. Yeah, so I think this example has explained all the parts on how you put up your mitigations, how you calculate your likelihood and consequence, how you actually calculate your risk. Then we've also looked at how you review and what will affect your review, and how will the risk fall after review. So there are certain moments when the risk even increases after you do the review, but then there are certain instances where maybe after your initial review, the risk will reduce to acceptable ranges. So you need to do this for all your identified risk in the process. So I'll just give this one example since I've explained it all the way to the end. So you do the same to your examination, part of the phase. So you do the same. So you need to look at all the identified risks in the examination as well as your post-examination. So basically, that's how you fill in the register. So by the end of the entire process of doing your hazard assessment, your process map, and also looking at the risk register, you need to at least have identified, or you need to have determined all the risk levels for all the process map risks that you identify, and also you need to have put up or proposed mitigations for all your unacceptable risks. Same applies to your hazard assessment. Of course, in the hazard assessment, you need to do your hazard identification. Then after that, you do your hazard characterization. Then there's that part where you're doing your personnel assessment. It is the personal assessment as well as the characteristics of the hazard that will tell you something about the inherent likelihood and consequence, and overall risk of each of the biological agents that you identify. So basically that's that on biosafety risk assessment. So in the next video, which is session should be session 12, we're going to look at biosecurity risk assessment. So we're going to look at biosecurity risk assessment using the Excel template. So see you in the next video.